I want to start with Jaylen Brown. We didn't do it earlier in the week when it came out because we were taping. And with a contract, especially one this big, the largest in NBA history, I want to be able to go through it, spend a little time on it. And since there's no real other headline for this, I'm going to go ahead and do it. Although congrats to Aaron Rodgers. So look, if you read the headline, you go 5 years, $304 million for Jaylen Brown, which is the highest contract in NBA history. You go, wait, what? A deal that's going to pay him $70 million in 28-29. And if you ask that question, if you go, well, does that make sense? I think a lot of you would say no. And I get it. If you're in the Celtics front office and you're debating what to do on this extension, you've probably been talking about it for like a year and a half. And you go, do we want to sign Jaylen Brown to a deal that pays him more than anybody else in NBA history? Now, if you're in the front office and you're trying to figure this out going into July, that's not really the fair question. It's not the right question. The right question is, if we don't do this, what are the alternatives? And the reality is the alternatives suck, okay? This is how a lot of players get paid. Not to say that they're not worth it, but it's the problem of the way the cap is constructed. And honestly, I've thought about it for years. Like, is there a completely different version? Could you tear it down and start over? Or there's some other way to have a salary cap where it doesn't feel like, hey, we have cap space. Cool, now you have to spend it. And you're like, oh, I don't really want to spend it on these guys, but we're not a good team. And now we've got to pay these guys this much. And now this contract doesn't really make a ton of sense, but we didn't really have much of a choice. Or in the Celtics case, at least it's Jaylen Brown, by the way, in the Celtics case, it's like, okay, we don't want to do this deal, but if you lose him with the amount of salaries that you already have committed moving forward, you can't just replace him. And I think everybody that listens to this pod knows that, right? But there can become some pretty basic conversations around it where it's like, oh, you can't spend that kind of money on that kind of player. It's like, okay, but you also can't spend anything close to that kind of money on the next player because you're just not going to have the room and you're not really going to be able to trade for him. And if that player is really good, you're going to go through the entire trade thing. And then hopefully there's a few teams competing for that player that's trying to be traded. And there's a bit more of a market. And now you're competing with other people. So it's usually the safest. It's the default position for so many decisions when we look at the financial numbers on a lot of this stuff. My feelings on Jaylen Brown are usually wrong. How about we start there? I didn't like him coming out of Cal. I was surprised they took him. When I talked to the Celtics, going back years after he had started turning into something, I was like, what did you see? And I was told, it was like Ainge just kind of looked at the rest of the class and everybody thought it was a two-person draft with Simmons and then Ingram. And it's crazy that Jaylen Brown's even in the conversation for being better than those guys. Of course, Murray's in that class as well. Although I still think Ingram's really good. They said that they felt like physically and athletically, like he fit this prototype of exactly what everybody in the NBA is trying to do with these big athletic wings that can also score and defend. And even when he was better than I thought he would be initially, I still was like, I'm not sure who he's going to be. And so I'll just say this. Every time he's broken through the ceiling of who I think he is as a player, or maybe I should say it this way. Every time I put a ceiling on him as a player and who I think he could ultimately be, he's crashed right through it. And I saw the Zach Lowe quote, and it wasn't Zach Lowe's opinion. It was the opinion of one specific front office evaluator who said that the Celtics are paying their third, maybe fourth, maybe fifth best player, $300 million. Now, there's a thing about making points is sometimes when you make your point, you ruin your point. If you don't love Jaylen Brown and you're in another front office, that's fine. And it's now become more of a thing. This thing with his handle has been going on forever. All right. It's always been a problem. It was a problem last year once Golden State realized it in the NBA Finals. It's like, hey, this guy, once he wants to drive, crowd him, and there's really not much that he can do. And this is not new, but now everybody's aware of it. And it's, he's just getting, whenever it happens, whenever there's a mistake, it's just everybody making the Jaylen Brown going left jokes. But what I don't like about that quote, because it's absurd to think that he's the fifth best player in the Celtics. And that's another thing that people do when they make points is they'll kind of go like, all right, I might be onto something here, but let me just ruin my credibility by exaggerating what I think the point is. He's not the fifth best player. He's not the fourth best player. If you want to spin it on a positive side, is Jaylen Brown potentially your best player on certain nights in big-time playoff games? And the answer is yes. And that's why he's getting this money. That's why he's all NBA this season. You may not think he's top 15. I'm not sure that I do. But for his age and the fact that he'd be 31 at the end of this contract, and there weren't better options. And by the way, the Celtics are a really good team. They're on a short list of teams that can go into this next season saying they've got a chance to win a title. So that quote, I thought, was just an exaggeration of a front office guy kind of being like, hey, it's just a runaway train of ideas. Now, here's another lesson with it all. And I'm guilty of this. So it's not a call out. It's reminding myself of this. And that is that when we see these numbers, when you start looking at the annual salaries, you're like, oh my God, like this is crazy. But let's go back and do a bit of a history lesson with this. If you look at the salary each year in relation to what the cap is now and what the cap projections will be moving forward, I'm not telling you it's a low number, but it helps you make sense of where these numbers are going. The salary cap for the upcoming season, 23-24, is $136 million. The cap 8 years ago was $70 million. All right, we're not even through that season. But 8 seasons ago, before the TV spike, the cap was $70 million. So almost double that in less than a decade. The TV spike money got it to $94 million. Kevin Durant, Warriors, Allen Crabbe deals, Evan Turner. Remember all that. Don't worry about it. But the cap goes up. John Wall's like, why am I making less than Reggie Jackson? All valid points. Not sure why they didn't smooth it out, but they did smooth it out, or they will smooth it out this time around when the new TV money comes in after 24 and 25, right? So we know that there's more of a smoothing. But based on history and where the cap has been, I think the 10% annual increase, which is what the new rule will be, and the new TV money moving forward years later, because I've seen some projections online and where the salary cap is going to go, I think it's completely fair, and I check with people on this, to project it out 10% increases every single year. So Jaylen Brown, as a Supermax eligible player, is able to get this kind of deal where he's 35% of the salary cap, right? If you look at the cap for next year, going off those 10% jumps, and we'll go through the next few years of what Jaylen Brown's deal is going to be, it's $149.6 million in 24-25, 25-26, about $165 million, then $181 million, then $199 million. 28-29, the final year of Jaylen's deal, it'll be just under $219 million. So that means from 15-16 to 28-29, less than 15 years, we're going to have an NBA salary cap that goes from $70 million to almost $220 million. Now, you could also counter this and go, why are you so certain it's going to keep going up, right? And we say that about housing. Don't worry about it. Houses always go up. It's a fair point, but think how much it just costs you in your daily life if you're into sports and if you have kids and all the stuff that you're investing in. You're like, wait, how much does that cost? How much does this service cost? How much does it cost to go to a game? What the hell? Like, it doesn't ever seem to be going down or plateauing at any point. And that's a bigger conversation of like, could there ever be a moment where people start rejecting sports or get sick of it enough? But with the new TV money that's going to come in a couple of years, I don't know how you're coming up with projections where the salary cap's only going to go up like 1 or 3 or 5%. It just doesn't really make any sense. Again, I checked with people on this saying you probably should use the 10% increases because that's the most likely. And that's the kind of run that we've been looking at here. So from 70 million to 14 years later to almost 220 million. So whenever you see these contracts come out, you're like, God, these numbers at the back end are staggering. And all they really are is just a reflection of a Supermax player making 35% of the cap. And that's what he'll be doing. And at least with Jaylen Brown, he'll be doing it at 31 years old when he's at that $70 million number. Let's look back at the Supermax in general. Now, just to review, Supermax eligible, 10 plus years of service, if the team still wants to pay you that after 10 plus years in the league, or 7 years and all NBA in the most recent season, 2 of the previous 3, defensive player of the year, which they should get rid of, or MVP, right? So Jokic, Supermax eligible, his first year's salary going into next year off of his Supermax is $47.7 million. Let's go back to 15-16, that number I keep using with a $70 million cap. LeBron James, he did a shorter deal, right? But he was eligible for 5 years and $132 million, which means his Supermax is less than half of what Jokic's is. LeBron's first year was about $23 million in 15-16 when he signed off his max contract of what he was eligible to do. Granted, we know he did shorter deals all the time to be able to have maximum flexibility. So in just a really short amount of time, 15-16 to 23-24, that supermax has gone from $23 million to almost $48 million in the first year. And I still forget that sometimes. And I think a lot of us do. So you see these massive numbers and you go, wait, does this make sense? Yeah, it does make sense because that's the language. Those are the projections moving forward. That's the way the Supermax works. Memo to NFL players. There's less of these guys on a roster. Pretty simple math. And so if you resist the headline, which I don't blame you for doing, or you go, really, is Jaylen Brown worth $70 million in 28-29? It's super easy to say yes. It's a lot harder to give me a realistic alternative that makes more sense for a team that thinks they're contending for a title.